Ah. Come on there. Okay. Alrighty, how's the sound? Let me know if we've got a 5x5, please. Perfect, cool, okay. Rex Bear and Gerald Clark. The name's familiar, but it doesn't really pop anything at the moment. Just getting set up here. I'm gonna need this too. Okay, let me go get that. Shot. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to do magnets, and I'll end up talking about the EoW boys, and just to provide them a legal hint. So remind me before we get done here, I've got a reasonably open amount of time. I've got a phone over there, so if it rings, my business call comes in and I'm good. Anyway, so I wanted to bring up some of our successes and failures in magnet experiments, because there's actually something here. It's marginal, but it's measurable. That is to say, if you take a multimeter and you know, attach your probes and ship to this, you can get measurable levels of voltage from a static. I use that word advisedly, but from a basically no rotating copper coil inside a magnetic field. What we're actually engineering here is a stationary, preloaded magnetic field, so to speak, right? And so our approach is the same thing that lots of people have instantly sprung to mind, which was to, let me dial that down a bit. Hang on. There we go. Okay, so the approach a lot of people take is just like us, all right? You have this is a side section. This is a PVC pipe. And the idea is to have magnet A and magnet B with the opposing poles so that they float, so that they levitate. We see this all the time with various little magnet toys, you know, that kind of thing. And the idea is that you would have, as we did, you'd punch a hole here and you'd have wire come on in that is your leads to a bifilar coil. Now ours is, mine got the shit smashed out of it, as I'll explain in a second, because I didn't do things quite right. But you take 50 gauge, 45, 40, something. The smaller the better, really. And I'm hoping to be able to discuss the idea of doing this with a foil, okay? basically an embroidered, stamped kind of a foil approach. So we don't actually have to wind all these coils because it's not necessary. What we're actually after is the surface topology, not the intervening windings themselves per se. Okay, so that having been said, let me proceed with this. This was our initial major experiment. The idea is that as you compress, I don't want to use those magnets. Hang on, let me open a new box. Okay, so I've got some boxes of magnets around, but it's not necessary that we involve ourselves with those at the moment because I'd have to open them all up, and it's quite the tedious process. A lot of the ones I've been using are either covered with ferrofluid, so I'm reluctant to touch them until I spend the time to get in and clean them off, or they've shattered because of my experiments. So here is a square neodymium magnet. The little red dots mark the north on this. Here are some round ones. I'm going to keep these bastards set aside, but this will show you how powerful it is. Hopefully this will show up. Here's a giant one, right? Big damn magnet inside this box. These are the kind of magnets you don't want to be messing with for a couple of hours a day because it'll affect your sleep. And I'm opening this thing up. I'm going to show you where the magnet is inside here, how far in it is. So we see that the magnet is basically isolated by this thick layer of not really compressible foam so that it's safe to transport it, actually. That's what they're doing, is trying to keep it away from problems in transport. But the point is, these magnets that we're dealing with, you saw that it's isolated here by several inches in this container. There's several inches of this foam stuff, and the magnet is right in the middle of it. Okay, so I'm going to take this other magnet, and this is the south side here, and we can see that we're getting I actually probably have the magnet in here in the wrong orientation, but this magnet right here is now resisting that other magnet, and we're a couple of inches off of the box, and that other magnet is a couple of inches inside this box, and I am not able to push them together. What it wants to do is to slip around or slip over. Okay, so let me go set these things aside so I don't cause any accidents. And I get rid of those two. Okay, so these magnets are so powerful that we are seeing a continuous expression of magnetic force into the material where us guys live and we think, and there's movement and all of this kind of shit. So I wanted to capture that continuous expression of force and convert it to my needs, right? Anti-gravity, electricity, you know, whatever the hell, right? So the idea was that since it resists compression, and I don't have enough physical force in me to really get it in there, I would ratchet down on these things. And I used a welding table. I used these big clamps that you would use to clamp large, irregularly shaped pieces to a welding table such that you could weld them. I don't have the clamp anymore because it broke. It was one of the parts that broke in this whole process. Because of a bunch of design issues that I'll get in here. So almost everybody's going to try this approach right off the bat, right, with a piece of PVC pipe because it's readily available. It's thick, it appears to be resilient, and so on. But you're going to have to bear in mind that you're going to have to drill holes in here to take your leads out. Okay, and everything you're going to do to this PVC pipe is going to reduce its ability to withstand these magnetic pressures. And first off, don't use round magnets. They just rotate inside the PVC and don't do you any good because they flip until they can join as opposed to opposing. And what we want to do is you want to take the magnetic force lines that are coming out of this magnet here and out of this magnet here, and we want to smush those together so that we get thousands and thousands and thousands and millions of the buggers. Because in space with magnets, compression equals capacitance. Okay, so if you really compress them together, you're getting bazillions of lines of force in there, and you can extract more energy, is the theory on this. Okay, so that's what we're doing, is we're squishing these things around a bifilar coil that's been previously inserted into the PVC. Okay, and so it just sits there. Now, okay, so here's a bunch of the goofiness. I used hot glue, so it made my bifilar coil thicker than it need be. You got to get this stuff really compressed. And so the thinner you can make this, the better. Anyway, I also had to reach into the pipe, and I used hot glue to build myself like kind of a little shelf that came on out at 2 different angles to hold the filar coil in a particular position. So I knew it was not bending or warping, because these things are really thin. And then I had the holes over here for the 2 leads to come out, because I wanted them separate so that I could have that potential impedance crossover effect should I desire to look at it. A lot of things I don't know about what's going to happen within this, and I explained the various different things I'm going to be trying, and you can try them too. And then if you get there ahead of me, you can tell me, oh, this shit doesn't work, and tell me why, and I can investigate it, okay? Or decide, okay, you're correct, and we don't want to do that. Anyway, so my sandwich here was a piece of silver coin and my bifilar coil, and then another piece of silver coin. Okay, and those are sort of the lips on the coin, because all of these things contributed to the fact that I wasn't really able to squish it together beyond a particular physical point, and that's what caused everything to break, right? Because the lips on the coin were actually interfering because of the size of the magnets I had. I didn't realize it until too late. Anyway, so, and then there's the magnets out over here. And I use these big square magnets that are these giant buggers that I have in the box. And I always put them back in the box because well, you can see how powerful they are. I mean, they just hold these other guys right off there a couple of inches away. And so the natural tendency of the magnets is to want to revert to attraction. Ah, crap. Okay, well, I have to dig that off of that table. Okay, so anyway, so here's the deal on this. So I had to do that. And then I was using this clamp that's steel, which was isolated from the magnets itself by a little chunk of wood that had hot glue and stuff around it, so that it was shaped like a cup to put the magnet into. And the clamps were like this relative to each other, and basically were being held off of the table by the bottom magnet glomming onto the steel welding table, right? So it's clamping like this, and I had to cut a channel down the PVC pipe. And so I stupidly took my channel beyond the midpoint, beyond these points right here. Apparently the hot glue had softened, or at least participated in softening my PVC pipe. And so what ended up happening was, when I got it considerably compressed, and I don't know how much that is, but I'm estimating maybe I got those 2 magnets within 2 inches of each other. So maybe this gap in here was 2 inches wide, and the force was so powerful that the magnets, they weren't, initially they weren't wedged into the tube. And then later on I had wood wedges I cut to try and keep them centered in the PVC tube itself. And so the wood wedges also contributed all of this kind of stuff, right? So anyway, by squeezing it down here, like I say, we were about 2 inches apart, I estimate, and the steel arm on my welding clamp torqued out, and then it twisted the hinge. So it was not prepared to deal with that level of resistance. Again, it never dawned on me that the bolt on the steel clamp would be a failure point. And then as soon as that happened, it was released enough that these 2 things started to try and rotate. And I'm not sure if they both tried to rotate the same direction. I wouldn't have thought so. I think maybe they were counter-rotating, but in any event, the whole thing flew apart right at this area right there. And the two magnets come crashing together and shredded the bifilar coil, cutting it to crap with the edges of the coin. So I mean, the whole thing was like, bloom, it was all done. Bits of plastic everywhere. The arms of the clamp I was using, which I was using another clamp to reef down on it, to try and get force. Now I realize I've got to go to really stationary things, hydraulics and all of that, because this is some dangerous shit, guys. You know, it was cleaning up plastic for hours. There were this area in here like almost vaporized because the bits were so small. And then I ended up with the tube all bent over and a bit of warped out plastic here that had blown out bits. And then these two magnets had come to rest and squeezed together against the broken bits of the plastic. And I'm just glad that there was still plastic between them, because I don't think I ever could have separated them. Would have had to taken them down to the local fire station. Had some guys there help me do it. Okay, so now there's a threshold here. So you've got to use powerful enough magnets to create this effect. Below a certain threshold, there's no point in continuing, because if you can squish the magnets together with your hands, then there simply is not enough attractive or repellent force in them. Even these are just massively hard to do. Okay, so you need that level of resistance in order to achieve these effects. So we'll be dealing with a lot of interesting things, but here's the deal. So I mentioned that within a couple of days, I got on the video, within a couple of days, I got, I don't know, 3 or 4 or 5 emails. Now I've had maybe 20 or 30 of people trying different effects on this. So I thought I'd save everybody a whole lot of trouble and point out a couple of things. That every time I stop experimenting and go read Boscovich, as Tesla says, I come up with better ideas, and I can eliminate a whole lot of experimentation that would have taken to get to that better idea. So I'm better off just sitting on my ass and finishing this damn book before coming on out here. But it's very tedious to go through the book. You got to really think about it. I still have maybe a couple 100 pages left, several hundred articles left. And there's some I'm going to have to reread because of the nature of the mathematics involved here with geometry. You got to plot it against. And I'll come to that in a second. Okay, so it's better for me to do this, to read the Boscovich, than come on out here and thrash around. But if people are going to thrash around anyway, as I read, I'll point out certain things that I may pick up along the way and tell you why I've eliminated a particular step and so on, right? And so, so there's a few things that I'm convinced of dealing with Boscovich, and a few of those are that we're probably going to be achieving better results with a different kind of a sandwich, all right? And the sandwich, I think, for reading Boscovich probably should be something like copper, silver, iron, which is our coil. Sorry, not iron, sorry, copper, silver, and copper again, right? So these are the sandwiches, and this would be our bifilar coil. Can we see that? Yeah, okay, so we can see that. All right, so the reason to do the sandwich here, according to what I'm getting out of Boscovich, is twofold. Then we need to look at some of the geometry of what's going on in the PVC pipe or in our restraining container, because I think maybe we need to start taking advantage of that restraining container itself. And so here's the deal. By squishing, and the magnets would actually be, okay, so we need to do 2 experiments. We need to have the magnets right here, or we also need to do an experiment where the magnets are out here in the sandwich for 2 different reasons, okay? And just to see what the generalized effect is. So let's look at our first case. Our most likely case would be to put the copper, and then silver activating layer, okay? And it also may be that we can extract electricity from the silver itself. So we need to actually look at that potential, and that is to have a silver takeoff layer, okay? But in any event, at the moment, we're just looking at a bifilar coil in the middle that will be our primary extracting point, 2 leads coming out from it, some inert silver. At this point, we're just going to eliminate the idea of extracting juice out of the silver layer as well, and leave that out of the picture. And then we're going to come out here to another layer of copper that will be one lead out on each side. Okay, now the reason to do this is something that Boscovich suggests. Yes, we know that you can get electricity out of the bifilar coil if you pass a load across it and pass a voltage source into it. You get the regular formula, which is, I think, 1/2 of the capacity times the voltage squared. Okay, so this voltage, if you increase it, you massively are able to increase the voltage you can extract out. So it's sort of like a little energy in and a big energy out. I think we can get around or not have to mess with this, because it's my understanding from reading Boscovich that if we align this stuff right, then we get basically we get a little tiny battery effect off of these two guys that can be used to feed back into this whole circuit. Okay, and so the idea is that there's enough potential capacitance trapped in these layers that and one of these coils provides us with a circuit, and the other lead provides us with a circuit there, in addition to the initial circuit here. So there's some things to check there. Now I'm going to go ahead and erase this so I draw that PVC pipe again, because one of the things I was thinking about was that the idea is at the moment I'm dealing in all flat planar surfaces. Okay, coins, the magnets, the bifilar coil, and so on. And so I was thinking for this other thing, so now we're looking down the tube. So here's our tube, and let's just say that we had our magnet in the tube. What I'm thinking about doing is the next stage up here for that outer copper layer is putting in a copper element. And it'll probably be banded down the tube in order to get the difference in potential effect, but it'll probably also be completely circular in order to trap it in layers as we go forward, because of the nature of these magnetic waves. So now I'm gonna take this out and draw the magnetic waves and show you something about this. Okay, so the magnetic waves of force come out. If you got a very weak magnet, you're very far away from it, you might get, like, let's just say, one perceptible magnetic wave spiraling out towards you in this in the spiky fashion that we see illustrated here with the ferrofluid. Wrong side. Anyway, so you're very far away. You only get really a little bit of an effect because it diminishes the relationship is the inverse of the square of the distance, right? The power falling off through space thing. Anyway, magnetic force lines, though, taken in the aggregate, have an effect that can be dealt with at the aggregate that is not initially apparent in the individual vortices of the lines spiraling out from the magnet itself. So if we have our magnet, we usually think of the magnetic field lines as doing something like this. Okay, this is how we've been taught to think of it in school, is that you have all of these magnetic field lines that want to come back in from the north and go to the south. It doesn't really matter. Our designations are entirely arbitrary on this, right? And so you get this kind of an effect off of magnets. Now, here's the interesting part of Boscovich's thinking on this, that if you've got two opposing magnets, and so let me draw the other side here. You have two opposing magnets. And I'm just drawing this in a different color for illustration purposes. But we'll assume that we're dealing with the same polar arrangement. Then we get of course, the opposite kind of an effect from each of these magnets. All right. But Boscovich goes to the trouble of telling us and showing us with his little charts and diagrams that there are spatial relationships that we can take advantage of that exist within the magnetic force lines themselves. In other words, we will find that there's force lines that line up like this across each of our magnetic, I didn't draw it very well, so that's what's going on there. We're actually, in a sense, compressing against this, against these springs, if you will, in the magnetic force line. Now also note that really what's going on in there is much more like these spikes. And so it's like the spikes are pointing at each other here, and they're going to merge, and then they're going to try and resist incredibly fiercely any further squeezing of that magnet, of those magnets within the materium, because those spikes are emerging from the dielectric, which is where the ether, where all energy is. And so they'll ultimately be able to out-resist us because we're made by that ether, so we'll never overcome it, right? But we can take advantage of these spikes coming on out here. And so what Boscovich points out to us is that the opposing magnetic lines, so now I got to get into black, hang on a second. Okay, so the opposing magnetic lines can be thought of roughly as parallelograms. And we can do a level of calculation off of these parallelograms that provide us some interesting information. And so we have a parallelogram that is formed by these magnetic waves from what is known as a limit point to another limit point. And the limit points are necessary constructs in our thinking because they are the point at which the spiraling magnetic line crosses the dielectric, okay? And then it comes around and it'll cross over here. Each of those are limit points. As it crosses, as it crosses the dielectric plane, we get limit points right there. But these limit points are effective out here insofar as the compression and the generation of electricity. So we can actually start calculating the H waves. I think they're called H waves. The force lines of the magnets, if they're brought down here, and the impact of that force based on the compression of the limit points. And at some level, I mean, there's actually formulas. I haven't gotten to it that far in the book, but when you compress them to a certain point, or to where we get a collapsing and distorted parallelogram, we can actually then determine where to extract our electricity and other useful information by simply doing and locating midpoints. Because all of this shit is happening around these midpoints relative to the limit points. And so in this particular crude parallelogram, under these kind of conditions, we would want our bifilar coil to be going right through there. And because that's going to be the exact point center of the dielectric plane as much as we can achieve it within the materium itself here. And so we can actually isolate that based on this. And it may be that relative to the magnets, if we had some ability to move the location of the bifilar coil, we could actually tune it. We could maybe adjust it up or down and increase the voltage or amperage as we chose within our little static mechanism, just by being able to fine tune towards that exact limit point, as opposed to more or less guessing, you know, so many inches, et cetera, et cetera. So there's all kinds of things to be learned about this parallelogram approach. Now, something else that keyed in on that copper was that we find that there is a shifting of the parallelograms that goes way the hell out. And so I was thinking, since we actually cross and create a number of limit points further on out with a distorting parallelogram, that we can actually gain another layer of useful electricity extraction out here, basically because of the delta, because of the difference between these 2 points and what's being created there. So, like I say, it's it's a work in progress in terms of reading Boscovich. I'll probably be on it because of my workloads and stuff for maybe, I don't know, maybe another month. And then, as I say, I've got to go back and reread a bunch of it. So, no, and I'm not going to take that blood test to prove I'm not out. Okay, so Finally, it's getting some heat in here. It's cold here. Okay, so anyway, so that was the thing about the idea of using basically not resonant bifilar coils, but a different form of extraction. So now okay, so if we understand Boscovich, the point of maximum power with magnets is the point of maximum compression, where you just can't get them any further. Now, physically, I'm not able to do that, but I can engineer a machine that will keep ratcheting down until I get it very, 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 very close, even though it's going to potentially come to the point of failure of the materials that push the magnet down, because at some point that will occur. On a sufficiently strong enough magnet, we will never, ever be able to get it to touch opposing poles, but we don't necessarily even want to. Now, so here's something I was thinking about. The idea of the bifilar coil is what is important, not the actual coiling part. So if we had a piece of stamped copper, for instance, you could have a square stamped copper plate that had the bifilar coil componentry engineered into it, because what we're actually after is a topology to where there are geometric differences in planar altitude at the sheet level, at the molecular level. So we might be able to engineer something that is basically it'd have to be isolated, have some of the other aspects of a bifilar coil with the individual coil elements separated from each other in some manner, but it may be able to be done mathematically by aligning our limit points such that they would hit there and there, and we would get that delta difference in charge. I don't know. See, I haven't gone that far, but I do know that it's going to be very, very, very small and extremely thin, because there we also get into a particular issue, right? And that is that if we get down to a certain thinness of copper, say we could go to something that's a copper coil made out of copper wire that was as thin as a human hair, it would probably go burst into flame or dissolve or melt or whatever when the magnets were pressed too far together, simply because of the amount of energy coming on out, it wouldn't be able to handle the amperage. So we're going to have those issues, the actual factual part of it. Anyway, so our next step is to recreate the bifilar coil, and then I'm going to read some more in Boscovich, and then so I'll probably come up to another adaptation and pursue that a little bit further along, because my goal is not the production of energy. That's going to be the electricity, extraction of electricity. That's going to be a side effect of what I'm after. And so I'll try and capture that production of electricity, because I'm going to need the electricity to generate the primary effect. But I'm not trying for this, free energy kind of thing, right? Or a static energy accumulator, which I'm quite certain can exist without any issues. So we should just be able to have like little tiny static versions of this. You just hook up to a battery and you can charge a battery. It might take you a while, but it doesn't matter. You maybe build these into devices and all that kind of thing. So it's just the beginning of this particular level of exploration of this side of the dielectric that we've never really, I haven't been able to find any literature other than Boscovich of anybody that's ever thought to manipulate the dielectric for something other than electricity, and to use the manipulation of the dielectric to produce electricity as a sort of an afterthought, or as a side effect, useful side effect of what you're doing. You just don't see much in the way of writing about that. Okay, so let me see. All right, so I wanted to talk about, no, the magnets would not be depleted. The magnets are, okay, so the magnets don't contain the force, okay? So there's no force in the magnet itself. They make these magnets by putting the materials together, smushing them down, and they ultimately coat them with chrome, but it's basically a ferroceramic or ceramic magnet, and then they shock it with electricity. Now, in shocking it, yes, it puts some energy into it, but we're not extracting out the initial electricity that was put in there to create the magnet. If that were the case, it would go flat, so to speak, as quickly as a battery. Rather, what's going on here is that because of the rigidity of the structure, the electricity that goes on in that does the shocking alters that structure, and it freezes in a quasi crystalline fashion. Okay, it's not a crystal, don't get me wrong, but it is as rigid in its own way as a crystal. And each and every one of these molecules or molecular points within this are actually accentuated and all lined up by the shock of the electricity, such that the magnetic effect comes out of it. So magnetic effects are coming out of every single, quote, atom or molecule in reality. But because they're not coherent, because they're not all in alignment, we don't notice them. It's just scattered. It's this general overall hum that is reality, okay? But when you take these things and shock them with electricity, all those atoms line on up, and thereafter, as long as they're continually lined up, their precessional deviation that exists within reality for all molecular kind of understanding, that precessional deviation all lines up, is what allows the magnetism to leak out, so to speak, from the ether. So we can think of this as an invisible hose going from here out into the ether, and that's where the energy is coming from. It's being extracted out of this ether. It's not actually in this little chunk of metal. This is simply our little doorway to producing the invisible energy. And it's really, I mean, it is just incredibly powerful. You feel it twisting in your hands as it wants to align with this thing 4.5 inches down below it. And, you know, you get them close together, I have to go to all kinds of trouble to, you know, I'm an old man. I can actually push the box, by the way, with this little magnet. So there's all kinds of fun stuff you can do with magnets. You can see it bump over as it hits that particular point where the magnetic fields want to line up. And then let's also say, you know, all hail Tesla, and everybody praise Boscovich, because that was one smart son of a bitch to do this in the 1700s, where he didn't have someone making him really classy magnets. He had magnets that were natural, or, you know, are enhanced, but enhanced not by electricity, but by mechanical motion and so on. So he really was a superior thinker in terms of being able to analyze all of this stuff without any of our modern tools. All right, so I got to get moving here. So one last thing was the brouhaha, the I don't know what to call it, guys. You know, I never thought David Wilcock was a criminal. You know, I thought he was goofy, and those conclusions were wacky, not well thought out. He never really seemed to think deeply, although he could recognize when others thought deeply and could steal from it, right? But I never thought of him as a other than, you know, a sort of a grifter kind, right? I never thought of him as an out and out, let's have a scam here and do this kind of thing, right? But let's make some assumptions just for the point of illustration. I mean, I'm not calling anybody a criminal. I'm saying I deliberately never considered David Wilcock to be a criminal. He was obviously good at what he did, successful at it to some degree, developed it as a skill, however he may want to characterize it. But it appears, though, that, okay, so let's hypothesize that, let's make this a hypothetical case, that we had the situation of Pete Peterson, and we got, say, 55, that's a terrible 5. My writing is atrocious, barely even an S. $55,000. Okay, more or less, right? That's the GoFundMe account. That's the point at issue relative to Pete Peterson. There are several other additional points at issue relative to this, all right? And so here's the deal, right? And so this 55,000 has several legal ramifications. And we have to ask ourselves a number of questions about that 55,000. And that was, initially there was fraud in the description of it. It was not the FBI coming on in and horrific, nasty local law enforcement trashing his house and throwing everything into a dumpster to deprive David Wilcock of his inheritance and to hide secret space technology. That was all bullshit. So there was a clear case of fraud in the creation at the inception of this, okay? Then there's the issue of whether or not Pete Peterson ever got the stuff. Did he receive the money? And then there's ancillary issues off of his receipt of the money, because now bear in mind that the complete load of bollocks up here, total absolute bullshit, started this off. They get the money, and Pete Peterson's supposed to get that money, and supposedly there was a power of attorney that was obtained by David Wilcock. All right. Now, that would be fine, but here's some things. Power of attorney has to have a notary seal to be valid. And so there should be some ID number that David Wilcock can provide to ID the notary, because it should be on the stamp on the damn document. If he's got the document, he should have all of this that he could provide. We could look it up and we'd know he was telling, being factual, right? Okay, so there's that. But now we hear that this point of power of attorney was obtained within the last 2 years of Pete Peterson's life. And it is my understanding that within those last 2 years, at some point, way back there, close to the beginning of those 2 years, his sister took over Pete Peterson's affairs by legally assigned power of guardianship, and Pete was put in a nursing home at some point, okay? So if he had been under guardianship, this power of attorney is null and void, would not have worked. If he had been in guardianship, he wouldn't have had a bank account to transfer to. If he had been in guardianship, his sister would have had all authority to deal with the banks, and the banks would have refused to accept anything that David Wilcock might have tried to put in there, even if he tried to do it, okay? So this is the basis for an examination as to whether or not there might have been something illegal going on. Now, I'm not going to pursue that any further because I cannot validate any of David Wilcock's actions in here. All I can say is that it doesn't add up. It doesn't look kosher. Doesn't look like it was legal, because on its face, prima facie understanding is not evidence. Okay, I'm just saying that my conclusions, just looking at it on its face, is that there's big gaps in time and this shit don't add up. But that doesn't mean that there's a crime here. However, here's my point. We have over here the EoW boys. EoW! Amazing! EoW! Okay, so the Edge of Wonder boys, right? Now here's their issue. They're basically making a video about this whole big bubble of stuff with David Wilcock. It's got like 104,000 people that have heard this. In this video, they are supporting David Wilcock's understanding and position of all of this. They never question him. They never ask any of the pertinent information about here. Do you have the notary's name? How'd you get a bank account if it was under receivership? Any of this. They never ask anything, right? They just accept what he says and parrots back affirmatives. Yes, we believe you. Amazing information. EoW boys. Okay, but the EoW boys are in real trouble because there's two conditions that could exist here, right? As we go through this, I'm going to give you two sets of binaries. That's how programmers think. Either there was a crime here, or it's my misunderstanding. No crime. Man, in which case, Big W is just the, it's the EoW boys, doing their wondering all over us. No big deal. Okay, but let's look at the other side. If there's a crime here, these guys are involved in it now. All right, they've crossed lines, so they are complicit. And so that just being complicit means that you could be legally found to be an accomplice at some level. So you guys at the EoW group here are complicit. And that is not just limited to Ben and Rob. That chain goes up to everybody that participated in the production of that video. All right, because that video supports and attempts, in my opinion, that video supports and attempts to persuade people that David Wilcock's viewpoint is accurate. It does nothing to cast any doubt whatsoever, to ask any questions, to seem in any way to be a representative of the audience. Ergo, they can't claim journalism. They're simply propagandists trying to put out a viewpoint. And here's the thing. Now, so let's go to another binary. So did they know or not? Was there a question? That's what will come down to in a legal case. Should the EoW boys get prosecuted for obstruction of justice or get prosecuted as accomplices after the fact? Okay, so that's what it's going to come down to. Not intent, but knowledge, because intent can be inferred from by an attorney or implied by an attorney to a jury, and the jury can infer intent from knowledge. So if the EoW boys here knew, and it could be shown that they had a preponderance of reason to suspect that it was true, that there was a crime, then they deliberately attempted to cover up a crime. They participated, that they created an illegal act, which is the cover up. You know, here we have the Peterson gate, right? Sort of like the Watergate. It wasn't the crime that got everybody in trouble. It was trying to cover it up that got everybody into trouble, because it keeps expanding out. So if there was a crime here with this, then these people up here, and it's not limited to the EoW boys. We've also got up here our jolly ass-ended master, James of ECETI, involved in that cover-up because of his relationship to the EoW boys and his support. So it could be said that he's also part and parcel of this. He hasn't been as involved in the whole thing here. This does not directly spill over, as far as I know, into the blue chicken directly. You know, the blue eagle chicken, Corey Good and his cult, because as far as I know, his hands weren't involved in any of this stuff. But I wasn't paying much attention to any of the details. And I'm only providing a very high level analysis of this simply because these guys are crossing lines that they may be so stupid they're not aware of. They may be so ignorant of legal issues and ramifications and their position within this drama, story, whatever the hell you want to call it, that they're unaware that they are doing things that put them at legal liability. And you know, we've seen enough drama and shit here. I just want to get all this crap cleaned up so that we can go back to Space Force, go back to, you know, floating RVs and, you know, buying used TR3s and doing fun stuff, right? TR3B things. Anyway, so we have the potential for a fraud. Well, we know that there was a fraud at the inception. Does it rise to the level of a crime? Not for me to say. That would be a jury. But that's pretty much for sure. You know, factually, there were a lot of statements made that were 100% false. And then they continued to raise money once they knew those statements were false, once it became certain that they knew those statements were false. And then they did stuff with the money thereafter. And so there's a whole subsidiary level of potential criminal activity there in the form of money laundering. So that we haven't even gotten into that. Being recently involved and talking to a lot of federal prosecutors and legal, you know, law enforcement types and so forth, as a witness, as somebody who they weren't even sure if I'd committed crimes or not. They didn't know what my participation in any of this shit was. And so they had to analyze and investigate and all that kind of shit, right? At the same time, they came to understand that I do have a good grasp of what was going on. And so I became something of a resource for these guys. This brings me back up to stuff. Okay, so in talking with them, they would bring up a question and I'd have to say, well, I don't know what its ramifications would be relative to that because I've never looked at that, okay, whatever it was. And a lot of these questions related to money laundering. I looked into that and it is like the most murky, yucky sewer of things you've ever tried to get around. Everybody is probably guilty of money laundering constantly just because the laws are so weird and vague and not precise, right? However, there are certain things within the idea of money laundering that are indeed able to be tracked through this kind of a loop, especially if Pete Peterson never got it, okay? Because that's the key definition where it's all money laundering at all levels comes down to deception. You want people to think it ends up over here, but it ends up over here. If that's what happened here, then not only are there crimes against Pete Peterson as an elder, not only are there moral crimes against the audience that David Wilcock thought he was serving by him dishing up fake shit from Pete Peterson and claiming it was real, but there are real crimes in the sense of the loss of the money, the potential criminality involved with an illegal power of attorney, because that's a federal crime there. If you have actually got a power of attorney, if you were able to obtain it or fraudulently create one and then used it to actually transfer the money into the bank, even that's a crime. Just because of the nature of know your customer and all this kind of shit, right? So I don't actually think that ever happened. It is difficult for me to envision, with my knowledge of the banking system and what a pain in the ass it is to deal with it. I've dealt with it internationally and at software levels as well. I've written software for banking transfer kind of companies, escrow firms, all different kinds of shit. So, and it just is a royal pain in the butt to deal with these guys. So maybe there's a lax system in Idaho, but I don't think so. People in Idaho I've met that I've dealt with, and I've called a lot of them in regards to this, because you can call the Idaho state government. They get pissed. They're getting really annoyed at people calling now, looking into this Pete Peterson thing. But they will tell you, very, very straight out. And these guys are sharp. So I don't see the Idaho banks allowing this kind of thing to go through. Now, it could be that he actually did get a, yeah, I know the banks are run by crooks, but they're regulated crooks. Okay, so he may actually have gotten the power of attorney before the sister got custody, right? Before she took over guardianship. Why didn't he say so? That'd clear everything on up. So if an accurate timeline could be put out there, not that he has to give a shit about my criticism, okay? David Wilcock need not care anything I say about this, but I sort of felt like, well, maybe I'm certain that Ben is not a great legal whiz. I'm also certain that Rob's a pretty sharp fellow, okay? But I don't know that he's ever dealt with the legal ramifications and the position that they're in. I don't even know that they can see the position they're in relative to these legal issues. And and then here's something else. They used to work for Epoch Times. I always had the skill set at extracting information at Epoch Times. I've always given them a thumbs up. They were pretty good, right? I don't necessarily agree with their conclusions. Certainly don't agree with a lot of their understanding on China. They're just hugely biased about it. Yeah, everything they may be saying is true, but the picture they're trying to paint is not an accurate appraisal, in my opinion. And I like Qigong. I do the exercises and shit, right? So I'm not opposed to their philosophy. I think the leader of the Falun Gong is, a Corey Good who made it, who was really successful, and is just a wacky son of a bitch. Wouldn't want to be on, don't even want to be on the same continent with him. But I always liked Epoch Times. What can I say, right? It reminded me in some regards of the news magazines I used to read in the 60s, Stars and Stripes and a few of these other things, because of the particular kind of mental thinking and journalism made it very easy for you as a reader to analyze, because their bias was so fucking clear in how they put it out. So I didn't want any, I want harmony, because we got to get this shit out of the way so we can get back to Boscovich, so we can start hammering on the potentials here and get advanced. All this kind of stuff distracts us. And, I'm a nuts and bolts guy. If people want to have experience conventions, that's fine, but don't try and take over every fucking thing and foist that view on all of us guys that want to play with magnets. Anyway, so that's my thing about the Edge of Wonder boys and their potential for legal problems over this as points of obstruction. And remember, obstruction of justice can be prosecuted after the activity. So if you now realized that you had done something that was illegal, and that there was an investigation, that's where it gets a little bit murky. If there was an active investigation going on now, and you started destroying evidence that supported your that showed that you were doing something illegal, that also is a crime. So be careful about that shit, right? Anyway, we have to watch out for all of this crap. I think the Edge of Wonder Boys are in real deep shit. I think that they're masters at, this is my opinion, that they're masters at epoch times and Newtang Dynasty are shitting the sharp hard ones, because they're in a no-win position with this, and something needs to break in order for them to be able to recover and back their way out of this. Because if it goes too far, then you involve and say that there was a crime and that there were prosecutors involved and that it continued out here, then you may find that, Epoch Times is drug in with all of this shit in this wacky kind of a back end kind of thing. And that won't do Epoch Times any good. And Epoch Times people need to understand that we're in an interesting political milieu, right? There's a lot of people out there, mainstream media guys, that would love to shaft Epoch Times, love to put the knife into them, right? That might do everything they could to maneuver circumstances for Epoch Times to end up in a wacky UFO case and totally destroy their credibility. Shit like that happens. Not that anybody's planning it or anything like that, but if I were Epoch Times, I think I might want to call in the EoW boys and say, EoW? Bye guys, I got to go. I got business meetings and got to go take care of puppies and stuff. So see ya. Thanks for checking in. I'm going to try and do as many of these Fun with Magnets things as I can. I'm reading at least 10 articles a day. Then I got to sit and cogitate on it and draw on shit. And so maybe every other couple of days I'll come on out and we'll have something new. But, just reading today, it was like it dawned on me, I don't have to mess with any of that, but I got to get these other materials here to figure out shit, about the precessional alignment of how these molecular things would line up such that I can analyze what they're likely to do to the magnetic fields, because Boscovich lays it out for us. Oops, shit, I gotta go. Sorry, guys, sorry. Uh-oh.